Labdien. Good afternoon. Welcome to our honorary guests, Her Excellency Ms. Elita Kuzma, Honorary Consul John Medvedskis, and American Latvian Association President Mr. Mārtiņš Andersons. Welcome to all our guests, whether you are here for the first time or are already familiar with the programming that we strive to provide on this very special day, the celebration of Latvia's independence. I'd like to take a moment to note the Latvian organizations in the Philadelphia area that are a part of the Council. They include St. John's Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Latvian Baptist congregations, the Latvian Language School and Folk Dance Ensemble Dzirkstele. They will, by the way, be performing next weekend. The Daugavas Vanagi, the Retiree Association, and of course, the Philadelphia Latvian Society. My wish is that we can take a moment to reflect on the freedoms that we have today, but remember that these freedoms all came with a price, and they should never be taken lightly. Novēlu saules mūžu Latvijai. Please rise for the singing of the national Latvian anthem. Dievs svētī. Please be seated. Thank you. As our first speaker, a friend and staunch supporter of the Philadelphia Latvian Society, please welcome John Medvedskis, Honorary Consul of Latvia for Pennsylvania. John.
Sveiki. We are Latvian. We are Latvians. I think that's the appropriate theme, for the day, considering this wonderful exhibition. I would like to express my gratitude to Janis Chakars and the leadership of the Philadelphia Latvian Association for having me here. I take great pride, as I always tell you, of being the representative of Latvia for the state of Pennsylvania. I would like to now really extend my welcome to Your Excellency and also to Mr. Anderson. Thank you for coming to Philadelphia, and I hope that you will return many times. We would love to host you and introduce you to the many, many cultural and historic treasures of Philadelphia. I would also like to extend my appreciation and really admiration to the American Latvian Association, to Mr. Dejevskis, and I think to also the museum director Gravers for organizing this wonderful, I think, informative exhibition that I think is probably very successful to tell the Americans, especially here, the long journey for Latvia to its independence. And I, of course, as an immigrant, was part of that story. And I think it will also serve personally well in a sense that it will help inform some of my American friends the difference between the Baltics and the Balkans. So again, it's such a pleasure to be here, and I would like to make a couple of remarks. Ambassador, we really welcome you to the United States. This is a personal, really, expression of thank you for coming. With your exemplary diplomatic career, I think you are the right person to be here at these difficult times, so it's very timely. And I think that especially when we have, again, a neighbor, a very nefarious neighbor threatening really our independence again. So, and Mr. Anderson, I really want to express my thanks and gratitude and admiration for all the work that you do with the Latvian Society nationally in terms of trying to really, it's a difficult job, but I think in preserving the Latvian culture and I think also the raising the profile of Latvians in America. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
And of course, I will invite the Honorary Her Excellency Elita Kuzma, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Latvia to the United States of America.
Dear Laila Mednes, dear Honorary Consul Medvedsky, godātie tautieši, dear friends of Latvia. It is an honor for me to be here today in this historic building purchased in the early part of the 20th century by the Philadelphia Society of Free Lats, considered to be the oldest Latvian society in the United States. And it is my great pleasure to address you all today in honor of the 106th anniversary of the proclamation of the Republic of Latvia and the opening of the touring exhibition, We Are Latvian. This exhibition not only reminds us of the tragedy of the dark years and decades of the 20th century, but also honors the foresight of the United States foreign policy based on a Summerwell's Declaration and the international non-recognition policy that was adopted by 50 countries, thereby creating the prerequisites for the successful return of Latvia and the Baltic states to the international community and to the transatlantic family. Latvian diplomatic service in exile during the occupation period helped the dream of the restoration of an independent and democratic Latvia to become reality. Today, the transatlantic ties between allied nations provide security and prosperity to the international community by aiding those most in need. As we look towards an unrestful world, Latvia is steadfast in securing its defense. We have increased our defense spending to 3% of the GDP this year. Latvia is also dedicated to supporting Ukraine. By law, pledging to allocate 0.25% of our GDP to its military aid annually. Latvia's security remains our top priority. Latvia and this great country, the United States of America, as strategic allies, strengthen their ties on a daily basis in ensuring that security and defense, economic security, mutual trade and investment, and innovation benefit our two countries and contributes transatlantic sustainability and prosperity. Dear guests, I would also like to highlight the role of the Latvian community in America as a force behind preserving the Latvian language and culture and pursuit of the Latvian-US bilateral relations and common interests. Latvians have long and proud history of showcasing their heritage and artistic abilities in the United States, from Mark Rothko and Mikhail Baryshnikov, architect Gunārs Birkerts, to the world-renowned composer Lolita Ritmanis. Art now serves as a ship we take our culture across the Great Pond. Today, future European capital of culture, the NATO port city of Liepāja, with its symphonic orchestra, is building transatlantic cultural and musical bridges with Hollywood. By recording the soundtrack for the movie The American Miracle by Heroic Pictures, which is dedicated to the celebration of the 26th anniversary of the United States, which we are going to commemorate in the year 2026. Latvians have always shone their brightest light across America while honoring their Latvian roots. Our Latvian community in the United States has always helped nurturing our culture, our language, and upholding traditions. And by doing so, they have helped to build a better future for Latvia. I thank the organizers of today's celebration and American Latvian Association. I would like to take this opportunity to recognize Renāte Grāvers, Director of the American Latvian Association Latvian Museum of Rockville, Maryland. Only because of her enthusiasm and dedication, part of the exhibition has now been brought here to Philadelphia and will tour nationwide. And I also thank Petris Dajevskis and his spouse for helping this exhibition to come here to this very historic and beautiful house. Mīļie tautieši, Latvieši Filadelfijā, no sirds sveicu Latvijas Republikas 106. dzimšanas dienā. Dievs svētī Latviju! Paldies!
We were very happy when the stars aligned and we received news that Mr. Andersons was able to arrange his travel schedule to participate in today's events. Please give a warm welcome to the president of the American Latvian Association, Mārtiņš Andersons.
Thank you, Lila. She wasn't kidding about that travel schedule. I was in Latvia last Monday, San Francisco 2 days ago, and now I'm in Philadelphia. And it's a pleasure to see you all. Madam Ambassador, Honorary Consul, ladies and gentlemen. On orders from Moscow, hundreds of thousands of troops and their tanks descend upon a peaceful and prosperous country with a clandestine goal to occupy its territory, exploit its resources, while linguistically and culturally repressing its native inhabitants. Thousands are executed or deported, and despite local armed resistance spanning years, the occupation is ultimately a success. No, that's not a tragic news summary from Ukraine's future, at least I hope not, but rather an episode from the historical experience of another country, Latvia, less than 85 years ago. It's a reminder that, unfortunately, history does sometimes repeat itself. But thankfully, in the case of Latvia, that history has a happy epilogue. After nearly 50 years of occupation by the Soviet Union, Latvia regained its independence in 1990 and is now, nearly 35 years later, a vibrant democracy with a growing economy, a respected member of the EU and NATO, and a valued ally of the United States. Latvia now has 2 Independence Days, or rather, an Independence Day, November 18th, and a renewed Independence Day, May 4th. We are here today to celebrate the former, and along with that, kick off a traveling museum exhibition, We Are Latvian, that covers 1,000 years of Latvian history, and in the coming months will crisscross the United States. As president of the museum's parent organization, the American Latvian Association, or ALA, I'd like to highlight why, in my view, that history is so compelling, and close by sharing with you what I hope this exhibition will achieve. You might ask, why does a country half the size of Pennsylvania, with a population barely a third of Metro Philadelphia's, warrant a traveling exhibition, let alone a whole museum? The answer is because Latvia's long path to independence is an inspiring example of a people, small in number, but with an outsized will to be free. Despite centuries of oppression and exploitation by larger, bellicose neighboring powers, Latvians have nurtured their ancient language, which is amongst the oldest in Europe, and in spite of many efforts to extinguish or dilute it, preserved a cultural heritage rich in tradition, songs, and costumes. The span of the Latvian existence covered by this exhibition unfolds like a drawn-out version of the classic David and Goliath story, with the role of Goliath alternating between the great forces of Northern and Eastern Europe, empires and autocrats, tsars, kings and bishops, Germans, Swedes, Poles, and Russians, each leaving their imprint on the land that would become Latvia. The Germans, the first in this roster of Goliaths, arrived in the late 12th and early 13th centuries in what was then called Livonia, now part of modern-day Latvia and Estonia. Their stated goal was to convert the local pagan tribes to Christianity, Livonia being the last non-Christian region of Europe. But the fact that they followed valuable trading routes used in earlier times by Vikings and renowned as far back as Roman times highlights that their motives were mercantilist as much as they were religious. When the local tribes proved resistant to Christianity, this missionary endeavor was reinforced by the brute strength of German crusaders, Teutonic Knights, who were encouraged by papal edicts to embark on a holy crusade against the so-called northern heathens. In time, these German crusaders conquered these native tribes, and their control over religion and trade would set the tone for the region for several hundred years. Their imposed feudalism ensured centuries of enrichment at the expense of the enserfed Latvian peasantry. Change for the Latvians, if you can call it that, came in the mid-16th century when regional conflict and outright war introduced new Goliaths to the Latvian saga. By this time, the Teutonic Knights and the authority of the Catholic Church were fragmenting. Shifting European alliances, the radical changes of the Protestant Reformation, and other geopolitical forces created internal and external threats to the ruling elites. Sensing an opportunity, this next round of Goliaths, Russia, Sweden, Poland, and Lithuania, embarked on a series of wars to dominate the Livonian region and more broadly control trade throughout the Baltic. These wars, sometimes lasting tens of years and collectively spanning 2 centuries, ravaged the landscape and subjected the local Latvians to a kind of geopolitical ping-pong between the Swedish and Polish empires, but ultimately landed them in the hands of an ascendant and expansionist Tsarist Russia, which would rule for nearly 200 years. Only in the middle to late 19th century, amidst a trend of relaxed laws governing education, does our metaphorical protagonist, David, first appear. Young, educated Latvians, inspired by socio-political movements elsewhere in Europe, began openly celebrating their native Latvian identity, its ancient language and culture, something previously unimaginable. And by 1905, they felt so emboldened as to even advocate for a Latvian nation state. Their publications, informal gatherings, organizations, and nascent political activities fueled a growing nationalism that by the early 20th century was primed to capitalize on the chaos of the Russian Revolution and First World War. Their moment came on November 18, 1918, when against long odds, the independent nation of Latvia was proclaimed. For the first time in nearly 7 centuries, Latvians were masters of their own homeland. It was a fragile independence that required many Latvian lives to enforce, but eventually their young nation thrived, becoming amongst the wealthiest in Europe by the late 1930s. But it was not to last. On the eve of World War II, like a perverse replay of previous centuries, adjacent great powers, 2 familiar Goliaths led by Hitler and Stalin, formulated different plans for Latvia, each harboring ambitions to control the Baltic. With the onset of the war, their armies crisscrossed Latvia, occupying the once free country, and by the war's end, its brief 2-decade-long experiment with independence was over. Forcibly incorporated into the Soviet Union, Latvia would vanish from the map for nearly 50 years. Its population either deported to Siberian labor camps, intentionally diluted with imported foreign labor, oppressed, or scattered across the globe as refugees in the wake of the war. But Latvians were resilient, and the idea of Latvia was not forgotten, neither by those who remained nor by those who lived in exile. In the ensuing decades, Latvians abroad via diaspora organizations like the American Latvian Association ensured the Latvian identity, its language and culture continued to thrive. Their political activism kept Latvia and its illegal occupation fresh in the minds of Western political leaders. In Latvia, parents and grandparents would tell the children about the Latvia that once was, quietly hoping that one day it would be reborn. Fate rewarded this resilience when in the 1980s, failed reforms within the Soviet Union amidst economic stagnation led to a renewed nationalist movement in Latvia. David, our metaphorical hero, rose again. In solidarity with diaspora communities abroad, Latvians behind the Iron Curtain began demonstrating against the occupation of the Baltic states, most famously in 1989 when 2 million Latvians, Lithuanians, and Estonians formed a human chain, the Baltic Way, over 370 miles long across the region. This activism translated into local political will, and pro-independence politicians in 1990, in a historic vote, successfully lobbied for the restoration of Latvia's independence. Once again, after a long period of oppression, resilient Latvians asserted their right to independence. David had defeated Goliath. Unshackled from Soviet oppression, Latvia began the hard work to become the vibrant democracy it is today. The Latvian saga is long and complicated, and the ALA Latvian Museum, thanks to its generous supporters as well as a recent modernization, does a far better job of telling it than I have today. But for many, a trip to the DC area is not practical, and it's what inspired the museum's management team to create this traveling exhibition before you. My personal wish for this exhibition, as it crisscrosses the US, is twofold. First, that the story it tells is shared beyond the museum's traditional audience, the Latvian diaspora. Sadly, we live in an age where armies once again breach sovereign borders and lay waste to landscapes, where authoritarian regimes deny individual freedoms and innocent civilians mysteriously vanish in the night. For Latvia and Latvian Americans, this is history, but for other diaspora communities here in the US and their respective homelands, this is the present tragic reality. And it is my sincere wish that this exhibit and its story reaches them and perhaps inspires resilience and hope for a better future. My other wish is that this exhibition sparks a dialogue between generations, between those old enough to have lived that history and those young enough to still learn from it. History is best taught by those who experienced it firsthand. There is nothing more powerful in the teaching of history than the words, "I was there." I was lucky enough to have two Latvian grandmothers live well into old age who shared with me their experiences growing up in pre-war Latvia and their harrowing journeys as refugees through wartime Europe and across the Atlantic to the United States. Unfortunately, there are fewer and fewer left who are old enough to remember World War II, but there are still many who lived under Soviet oppression, who held hands in the Baltic Way, or marched here in the US against Latvia's and its Baltic neighbors' occupation. If you are among them, leverage this exhibition to talk to your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors' grandkids, and with regards to the darker chapters of Latvia's recent history, make them take heed of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza's words, "If you want the present to be different, study the past." In closing, as a lover of history, as a Latvian American, and as the great-grandson of the man who proclaimed Latvia's independence in 1918, I'd like to express my personal gratitude that this touring exhibition and its message of resilience can start its tour here in Philadelphia, home of the oldest Latvian American organization, the Latvian Society of Philadelphia, and significantly, the birthplace of another country, the United States, whose own courageous inhabitants over 250 years ago, only a mile from here in Independence Hall, asserted their right to liberty. God bless Latvia and God bless the United States. Thank you.
Paldies. Okay, this time of year is also the time when we reflect and honor those individuals that have given of themselves to the Latvian community. Today, one of our own is getting that honor. This person has devoted many years to the preservation of Latvian art, has been the president of the American Latvian Artists Association, and co-founder of the Global Center for Latvian Art in Latvia. This past summer, she curated a wonderful exhibit specifically for Latvian artists of Philadelphia. On top of that, she herself is an artist who continues to actively exhibit her work. These are just some of the accomplishments and accolades that she received from her peers. I'd also like to add that she has been a long-standing supporter of the Philadelphia Latvian Society. Pasaules Brīvo Latviešu apvienība piešķir atzinības rakstu par nopelniem Amerikas latviešu mākslas uzturēšanā un saglabāšanai. Please give a warm but rousing applause to our own Gunna Mondheim.
I'd like to say that I'm very, very honored by this. I can't say that I'm surprised because a couple days ago I got an email but I was forgetting it. So I'm not surprised, but I'm still very, very honored. And not only am I honored, I'm very grateful for the opportunities that the Latvian community so many times has entrusted me and allowed me sort of little pieces of leadership for which I felt in many ways unqualified, but I learned from them. And so it's all been, in a certain way, a kind of a benefit to me. And I hardly deserve any kind of award for it because it's been good for me to be part of the Latvian community and that way. And the Latvian community has invited me to be part of them. So I'm very grateful. I thank you.
And now, as we near the part of the program where we will hear firsthand accounts that led to the proclamation of independence in May of 1990, I'd like to introduce you to the board president of the Philadelphia Society of Free Lets, Janis Chakars.
Thank you, thank you. We are so proud to host this exhibit. We are so proud to host this event. We are so proud to have these distinguished guests with us today. And we are so proud to be the oldest continuously operating Latvian Benevolent Society. At this time, I have the honor and pleasure of reading to you a proclamation from the mayor of Philadelphia before introducing the panel that Lila just mentioned. Excuse me. As the first World Heritage City in the nation, the city of Philadelphia is proud of how our multicultural population promotes understanding of new perspectives and introduces their heritage for all of us to experience. Now officially a certified welcoming city by the nonprofit Welcoming America, Philadelphia flourishes with the diversity of our residents who enrich us with their infusion of culture, art, tradition, and skills. We are honored and privileged that these men and women chose to come here to Philadelphia to live. The city of Philadelphia is the proud home of choice for many people of Latvian ancestry. The first Latvians to emigrate to the United States arrived in Pennsylvania in the 19th century. Since then, citizens of Latvian heritage have become very involved in our city and contribute much to Philadelphia and our nation. Philadelphia has a long-lasting connection to Latvia through the Honorary Consul of Latvia, John Medvekis, and the Philadelphia Society of Free Lets, also known as the Latvian Society. Their mission is to foster public appreciation and understanding of the Latvian culture and language, to maintain and preserve archives, records, books, manuscripts, bibliography, and all materials, literature, documents, and papers relating to the Latvian culture, art, and language, and creating a better understanding and preservation of their traditions among Latvian immigrants in the city. On Monday, November 18, 2024, the city of Philadelphia joins the Latvian American community of Philadelphia with a ceremonial raising of the flag of Latvia at City Hall. Yeah. Therefore, I, Sherelle L. Parker, Mayor of the City of Philadelphia, do hereby proclaim the day of Monday, November 18th, 2024, to be Latvian Independence Day in Philadelphia, and urge all residents to be aware of the many contributions of the Latvian American population of our city, as well as helping make Philadelphia a welcoming city of choice in which to live, work, and prosper. Sincerely, Sherelle L. Parker, Mayor. Wow, that was fun. So the flag will go up at noon on Monday, and it'll be in front of City Hall for 24 hours. So I encourage you all to go and admire it, take pictures, take selfies, post them on social media, do all of that, because it'll be fun. It'll be great for us and for Philadelphia. I'll introduce the panel, and I'm really, really excited to do that. I'm especially pleased to introduce this panel bearing witness firsthand accounts of Latvia's fight for freedom, because these events were formative in my own life and in my own career and my own education. As a teenager, I visited Latvia for the first time with my family, and my sister and my mother are here, in August 1989, and we attended the now legendary Baltijos Cells demonstration. Somebody there gave me a T-shirt to wear. It said, Latviju Latviešiem. And I think of that now, like how like radical it sort of was. But I'm just a kid. Like, thanks for the shirt. Like, I was into it. And we stood near the Freedom Monument in this node of this long chain that stretched 2 million people wide across 3 countries. and nobody knew how close or how far freedom really was, but confidence was in the air. I next went to Latvia in September of 1991, shortly after the August Putsch, when tanks rolled in the streets of Riga. I arrived on a Soviet visa, and on September 6, the USSR recognized Latvia's independence. At Christmas, the Soviet Union was gone. These events caused me to declare a major in political science as an undergraduate and to later study much more seriously as a graduate student researching the independence movement. Some people say that the USSR imploded under the weight of its own internal flaws. Some people say that the United States defeated it in the Cold War. People generally speak of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Internal flaws and external pressure were factors, but I do not think that either are sufficient to explain the death of the Soviet Union. In fact, I don't think it collapsed. I don't think that's the right word. It was abolished. It was torn down by people who wanted their freedom. First among these people were the Latvians. Actions taken by small groups like Helsinki 86 in 1986, and then by larger groups like the Tautas Front in 1988, and then even bigger groupings of people, like when I first visited on August 23rd, 1989, when this human chain was formed between three popular fronts, coordinated by three popular fronts. In his memoirs, Mikhail Gorbachev wrote that it was a parade of sovereignties that started in the Baltic states that did in the USSR. I think he was right. So when Latvians fought for their freedom, their effort changed the arc of world history. And we are lucky today, as Martin Andersons pointed out, we are lucky today to have people with us who bore witness to these events and who can tell us their stories. So we're going to have a panel with four such people, moderated first by Renate Gravere, and I invite you all please to come up and I'll introduce you. Renate Gravere is the director of the Latvian Museum, as you heard. She was born in Latvia in 1944 and came to the United States at the age of 5, knowing no English. She has a BA with honors from NYU in my hometown, is an interpreter of Latvian with the official language services of the U.S. Department of State, and she will moderate the panel. So. Our panelists are Rita Laima Rumpetera Berzinch Altau. That is the best name I've heard in a long time. Rita Laima studied at the Parsons School of Design in New York. We got a lot of New Yorkers in the house today. Before moving to Latvia in 1982, here in Philadelphia. She experienced life under the Soviet regime. Yeah, she moved there in 1982. She experienced life under the Soviet regime, described in her 2017 memoir, Skylarks and Rebels. Rita Laima is a published writer, translator, and illustrator. We have Aya Selma Evans. Aya Selma Evans was born in Riga. She is a graduate of the University of Latvia. Aya has worked at the University of Latvia, the National Library of Latvia, and the U.S. Agency for International Development. She is currently working at the Foreign Service Institute, teaching the Latvian language and culture to American diplomats who are posted to Latvia. Helena Vīksniņš is Vice President of Education and Professional Relations at the American Academy of Optometry. As the daughter of Latvian immigrants, she worked tirelessly in the 1980s to ensure that Latvia's unlawful fate, being occupied by the Soviet Union, was known by the public at large. From 2011 to 18, she directed the Latvian Cultural Heritage Camp Trīs reiz Trīs. She is a member of the Latvian folk ensemble Sudraba Avots that shares Latvian polyphonic harmonies. Helena also programs radio shows at both WPFW and Tacoma Radio. We have to talk about this later. I have a radio show too. Uwe Hodgins was born in Toronto, Canada, but has lived in Germany, Jamaica, not Queens, New York, no, Jamaica, and now Alexandria, Virginia. She lived in Latvia, her mother's birthplace, from 1989 to 1994, and witnessed the country change from a Soviet-occupied state to a fully independent democracy. So without any more ado, I'll turn it over to Renate and the panel. Thank you so much for being with us.
Your Excellency, honored guests, welcome to the 106th anniversary of Latvia's first independence and to the inauguration of our traveling exhibit, about which we will hear later from the heart and soul, from the two hearts and two souls of that exhibition. I had such good history lessons from the two speakers before me that half of my speech is gone, but I will try to do my best. During Latvia's long history that stretches from the Stone Age to the present day, it has proclaimed its independence and sovereignty as a nation only twice. Once after World War I in 1918, that is what we are celebrating today, but that period lasted only 22 years. But proclaiming independence alone does not mean that the occupying forces leave. It took up to 1921, through raging battles, for the occupiers to be driven out. All of them at that point. But in 1940, occupiers again decided that they wanted this strategically located place on the earth. And they actually stayed from 1940 to 1991. Even though we did proclaim independence a second time on May 4th in 1990. Today, we are celebrating the victory of 1918, but we also have to remember the hard-fought movements throughout the world that led to the victory in 1990. Before I go on to a little bit more about history again, I just want to tell you that we did this panel on May 4th of this year because the museum feels, the Latvian Museum feels, that it is not enough that we just tell ourselves, that we tell the Latvians how we feel and what we've experienced. We have to let the world know. We have to tell the world how hard it was to get that freedom and what it cost. And that is why we will hear these eyewitness accounts. We heard them on May 4th, and we had a very positive response from people. There were quite a few tears in that audience. And we were asked to participate in a history conference, which occurred on October 19th of this year at Montgomery College in Rockville, Maryland. They were surprised. Why was Latvia a country that had nothing to do with Montgomery County? Why were we there? But the response was excellent. And we were written up in the Latvian newspaper, so if you want to take a look at that, you can see something about that. That is why we felt that it is necessary that we also show you how four people lived through this time, how they felt, and how their families felt. So let's walk through history quickly, this time quickly, again, and see how all this came about. As you may remember, Hitler and Stalin had agreed to divide Europe between themselves in a secret protocol to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. But their greed, avarice, and hubris led both of them to want more and more of each other's territory. With the occupation of Latvia by the Soviet Union and its incorporation into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, in 1940, the repression and reign of terror began there. In one night, thousands of people were rounded up and deported to Siberia because they were, and I quote, a danger to the state or had maligned the state, end of quote. Then, in 1941, another power invaded, the army of the Third Reich of Hitler. And as you know, nothing good came of that. By 1944, the year I was born, and I was 3 weeks old, when the invasion by the Russians was imminent again. The war had turned around, the German army was in retreat, and the Soviet army again invaded and occupied Latvia. At that point, over 100,000 inhabitants, knowing what could be in store, decided to flee to the west. The years that followed were harrowing ones for those who stayed behind, with continuing repressions and another massive deportation of about 45,000 persons in 1949. Some of those deported returned to Latvia after their sentences of 20 years or more of hard labor were fulfilled, but they were broken both physically and mentally. Most of them never returned, and we do not even know where their final resting places are. The refugees fled mainly to Germany, but later emigrated to many countries throughout the world. From the time of Stalin's death in 1953 to the mid-1980s, there was no hope of change for the satellite countries. Only with the coming of Mikhail Gorbachev to power in the Soviet Union in 1985 was there a slackening of the reins of control. The Latvian people realized that this might be the time to try to change the dynamics of power in the country. Their open and clandestine efforts culminated in the Declaration of Independence on May 4th, 1990. Protests abroad, as we shall hear, also kept news of the repressions and torture of dissidents in the world's eye. But many forces came into play in Russia itself, and only in August of 1991 was true independence gained in Latvia. It was gained with the help of thousands of farmers who answered the call to come and protect Riga from the barbaric Soviet Oman, the Black Berets, forces that tried to enforce submission. They came with their tractors, their pitchforks, their lives to save the city and the country. It had been a truly surreal experience, according to one observer, that people were sitting by bonfires every night, waiting for the supposedly inevitable. But that never came. Instead, freedom rang out. Latvia became a free and sovereign nation again. It is now a staunch member of NATO and of the European Union. We know that it is not enough to state that freedom was regained. We have to show the world that the struggle was fought and how it was fought. That is now why we will hear eyewitness accounts from 4 people who experienced all of that turmoil. Our first speaker today is Rita Laime-Bērziņš, a Latvian American born in New Jersey, who decided, as Mr. Chakars said, decided to go live in Latvia in 1982. She's the author of a fairly thick book called Skylarks and Rebels, a book about her experiences there. Rita Laime comes from a family of poets, artists, and jurists. Her grandfather was a judge in the highest court of Latvia during the time of freedom. Please, Rita Laime.
Thank you. Mīļš, paldies. Ir mazliet dīvaini jūs uzrunāt angļu valodā, jo es esmu pieradusi vienmēr runāt latviski 18. novembrī, bet šoreiz angliski. Jā, kā Renāta teica, manu grāmatu var pasūtīt Amazon.com, kam interesē mani piedzīvojumi padomju okupētajā Latvijā, kuru interesē mūsu stāsts par neatkarības atgūšanu. A new era. 33 years ago, when I was 31, Latvia regained its independence after more than half a century of Soviet Russian totalitarian rule. I actually remember where I was. I was in Valka at our house in the countryside, and I woke up to news of the putsch in Moscow And after the failed putsch, it was absolutely clear that Latvia had regained total independence. And it's indescribable, the feeling that we all felt that day. However, returning to the Russian era. This crushing era was characterized by Russification, repression, colonization, corruption, unchecked pollution, and the persistent destruction of our historical memory, which was most painful. Latvia's military occupation ended in 1994 when the Soviet armed forces finally withdrew. Only then could we breathe easier. The tanks, planes, troops, and generals were gone. And I had seen them on a daily basis in Riga when I was living there. Their departure marked the end of a long, dark chapter in Latvia's history. I ventured to Latvia for the third time in late 1982 at the height of the Cold War. I fell in love and decided to stay. It was a very unusual step to take, to be sure. In the beginning, I wasn't sure what I would face, but my young love burned bright, lighting the way. I was also filled with a patriotic love that my family and Latvian society had instilled in me here in the United States. My experience of growing up in a democracy worked as an invisible shield. I was equipped with very strong reference points, which included freedom of speech, the plenitude and opportunities of a market economy, and the free press as champions of transparency. As an outsider, I became a silent witness to my nation's oppression and decline. Soviet-occupied Latvia's strange and cruel reality did not jibe with what I knew and believed. Communism was a fake ideology rotting the moral fiber of society. However, the jokes back then were very funny and helped people survive. We did laugh a lot. My strong perspective on Latvia was based on my parents, and especially my grandparents' loving memories of pre-war Latvia, considered the golden era, when Latvia's economy was competitive in the world, people traveled, and most Latvians believed in a bright future for their young republic. What I got in Soviet-occupied Latvia was a people living in fear, a society contaminated with informants, an education system based on lies, and a foreign ideology shaped by cruel Russian tyrants. My people were being slowly smothered by Ruski Mir, which was obsessed with militarization. I had to report to KGB interrogators, wasn't allowed to travel or attend school, our phones were tapped, and when my son was born in 1984, I faced the possibility of his conscription into the Soviet army, known for its brutal hazing. Of course, I clung to my US passport. With it, there was always the possibility of flight back to the land of the free and the home of the brave. We lived in a tiny, cramped, old Riga apartment, which is why I left it often to go on long, solitary walks. In the early 1980s, these walks through the oldest part of Riga helped me deal with the ugly manifestations of Soviet life. As I gaze upon the mighty Dome Cathedral that we lived next to, which dated back to 1211, I was compelled to believe that the darkness of that era would one day pass. And so it did, much to my shock and joy while I lived there. Today, Latvians celebrate Independence Day without fear. Towns and cities are festooned with the Latvian national colors, once forbidden under Soviet Russian rule. On Lāčplēsis Day, the War Museum is full of visitors, young and old, learning about Latvia's stories of extraordinary courage and loss throughout history. Finally, our story is out there for all to see and read. Historians are sifting through evidence, trying to catch up with half a century of censorship. There is much for all of us to learn, appreciate, and accept. My experiences in Latvia taught me multiple things, both practical and philosophical, lessons about life and values. November for me will always be Latvia month. In the dark month of November, my soul is always back in Latvia with my people and ancestors. However, this November, the results of America's election day shook me up. The experience of the Latvian nation has taught me just how fragile freedom and democracy are. Like clean water and air, you simply cannot take them for granted. The world is different than it was when I ventured to Latvia for the first time with an enormous backpack and suitcase. In 1980, I passed through the Iron Curtain into a world of lies and hatred. The war in Ukraine is a constant reminder of Russia's threat. Today's world is clouded by misinformation and disinformation. Saules mūžu Latvijai. May Latvia live as long as the sun. Freedom and democracy. On this day in 2024, these words have never seemed dearer. Thank you. Paldies.
Our next eyewitness to history is Aya Salma Evans, who was born and raised in Soviet Latvia. She will tell us about the emotions evoked by the regaining of independence. As Mr. Chakars had said when he read the biographies, Aya is currently an instructor at the U.S. Department of State Foreign Service Institute, where she teaches the Latvian language to diplomats who will be stationed in Riga. She has a very nice young woman right now who has been coming to various functions and who really is very, very enthralled with everything Latvian. The curriculum of the program at the Foreign Service Institute requires, and Aya has made sure of this, is that her students visit the Latvian Museum. That's part of the curriculum, or else they don't get to go to Riga. Aya has introduced them to many aspects of Latvian life and its culture and its traditions. Please, Aya.
Yeah, so my life story was completely different from Laima's. As Renata said, I was born and raised in occupied Latvia, and until my adulthood, I didn't know actually what it means to live in having democracy, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. That all was taken away from us. However, I'm forever grateful to my grandparents because they shared stories of their life before the Latvia's occupation. And they taught me so much about the history and the symbols that we have of national identity. And I will try to shortly tell about how I felt about regaining those. Under Soviet rule, these symbols, our flag, anthem, God Bless Latvia, Monument of Freedom, were just not banned. They were considered illegal even to mention. Of course, 138 feet tall high Monument of Freedom is which was built by the public donations and unveiled in 1935, was impossible to hide. But still, there were interpretations that it shows the Latvian, thanks to the Soviet power, the gatherings around the monument were forbidden. The public transportation circle was built around the block to block access. And people were just rushing by, too afraid to stop and read these few words that's carved on the base, for fatherland and freedom, or to gaze up to the statue representing liberty. Nevertheless, these symbols remained alive in many hearts. When the Third Awakening began in the late 80s, the process of reclaiming Latvian national identity was both dynamic and deeply emotional. The first powerful moment of the awakening came in 1987, when the group of Latvian patriots, Helsinki 86, laid flowers at the Monument of Freedom to honor those who had been deported by the Soviets. They proudly held the flag, the Latvian flag, in public, and that hasn't happened for the first time since 1945. My grandmother, whom we lovingly called Omite, often spoke about her pre-war life in Latvia with great fondness. And quietly she wished, if only I can see the Latvian flag flying everywhere again before I die. Her wish came true. In the summer of 1988, during the Baltic Folk Festival, Baltica, we proudly brought the flags in the concert hall, and with tears in our eyes, we sang folk songs of strength, resilience, and for hope. And by the end of that same 1988, the Latvian flag was everywhere. People dug flags out of their hiding places in sheds, attics, spots in the garden. It was a miracle also that so much beautiful maroon fabric could be found to make the flags in a time when everything else was so drab and gray. Omid had another wish, to hear the Latvian national anthem sung in the public once more. During the Soviet era, we would quietly sing it at home on November 18th, but that was just when the curtains were closed and nobody around who didn't belong to the family. In September of 1988, this wish also came true. At a massive public gathering of People's Front in Riga, the Latvian anthem was broadcast live on the radio. I was on a student trip then in St. Petersburg that time, and hearing it, I had to check what is really coming from Riga, or was it broadcast from the Voice of America or Radio Free Europe? It felt like a dream, but it happened, and we started to sing it from then, always. Working at the National Library, I recall receiving numerous calls from people asking about the correct word order for the anthem or the exact proportions of the Latvian flag, because all that information was, again, hidden for 50 occupation years. People were excited to use these symbols, but they wanted to use them with pride, honor, and respect. And my dear grandmother, Omita, had only one final wish. Can we ever become independent again after these 50 plus years of occupation? And that came true also. On May 4th, 1990, I sat on a windowsill at work across from the Supreme Council building, now the Saima, Latvian Parliament, and thousands of us were waiting, counting votes as they were broadcasted over the radio, hoping for enough votes to pass the declaration for the renewal of Latvian independence. And it seemed like forever, and it was so tense. But when finally it passed, the members of the Supreme Council were greeted with flowers and applause. Omid, who have lived through so much, that day said, "Thanks God, I will die in free Latvia, and my grandchildren will grow up in a free world." But we had no idea that actually still we have to endure to achieve full independence, that we'll have to overcome so many obstacles, provocations, hardships, that we'll have to build barricades in January 1991 and sit at the bonfires in the front of our parliament and government and to bury our fallen victims. And then in August 1991, during the putsch, again, Soviet armed vehicles rolled through the streets of Riga. And again, Soviet soldiers with Kalashnikovs in their hands and hatred in the eyes were looking on us. And we thought, will we keep our independence? But yes, we did. Because on May 4th, 1990, the Latvian nation had already spoken loud and clear. This is Latvia. This is not Soviet Union. And Latvia is free, and it will remain free. And God bless Latvia. Dievs svētī Latviju.
Helen Vīksniņa is a Latvian American born in the United States, whose father was a professor of economics at Georgetown University. Her maternal grandmother was the director of the Latvian office of Voice of America, and her paternal grandfather was a history professor in Latvia. Helen was very active in many of the demonstrations for Latvian and Baltic freedom throughout her life. She is still very active in the Latvian community in Washington, D.C. In fact, right now she is head of the council of the Church of the Washington Latvian Lutheran Church. So, Helen, please.
I hadn't included it in my remarks, but I was also there at the Baltic Way. So, in 1950, my parents arrived in the United States as children, displaced, uprooted from their homeland of Latvia, after surviving this uncertainty and despair of German refugee camps. My father's father, Nikolais, had been a high school history teacher in Riga. He was going to be a professor. I read this just yesterday from Likes. He was going to be a professor, but he ended up having to be a high school teacher because of the Russians coming in. So he also worked in several camps to set up the curriculum for the Latvian schools, along with Italaima's grandfather. Nikolais Vīksniņš was also integral to this society's organization and activities in the 1950s and 1960s, as well as worked on getting the Latvian school together in Philadelphia. And I think many of you were his students. My mother's father, Konstantins, never made it out with his family. We waited, not knowing if he was dead or alive, as he had been conscripted into the German army as an embedded war journalist. Our family's hopes ebbed and flowed, always wondering what had become of him as he disappeared into the vastness of Siberia. My mother's mother, Irene, had been a journalist in Latvia, so she threw herself into continuing that work in exile. Here in exile, she fought relentlessly through sleepless nights, early mornings, tireless work to ensure our culture and language wouldn't fade. She participated in organizing the Latvian diaspora, church, children's camps. She was involved with the Katske Nometne, Latvian schools, and wrote books, literature for young people. I tell you all of that as a backdrop for my own role, as well as others from my generation, the first ones born in exile. Some families decided to assimilate and didn't pass on the language and culture to their children. Not my family. Grandmother Irene's greatest fear, the one that kept her awake at night, was that her children and grandchildren might never speak to grandfather Konstantins again if we forgot our language, if we forgot where we came from. So while other families chose assimilation, we clung tightly to our roots, speaking Latvian before we even learned English. She couldn't bear the thought of us being strangers to our own past. By the time I reached my teens, I wasn't just participating in the fight to spread knowledge of what had happened to Latvia. I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just history, it was my story, my ancestors' pain, and our people's undying spirit that compelled me to act. So it made sense that I would be an active participant in the ongoing struggle of our diaspora to spread the knowledge of what had happened to our country during the Second World War and do whatever I could do to help the Baltics become free again. The late Congressman from Georgia, John Lewis, talked about good trouble. That is the idea that meaningful change requires disruption, confrontation, and the willingness to challenge unjust systems. He believed that nonviolent but disruptive actions such as sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches could transform society. In the mid-1980s, the Baltic youth in the Washington, D.C. area, and of course in all of the places that Balt settled, they put their minds together to envision good trouble. disruptive actions that could get on the news and let more people know about the injustices that were happening in Soviet-occupied Latvia. I personally participated in and helped organize an overnight hunger fast on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a parade of cars with caskets and signs on top, and countless demonstrations at the Russian embassy. Every act felt like a plea to the world. We were screaming for justice, for our country, for our families. One very impressive demonstration that I attended was a gallows set up in a square on K Street where Latvian youth were hung. In another, young men set their feet in cement so it would be very hard to remove them from in front of the Russian embassy on 16th Street. In 1980, one of the most dramatic demonstrations was done by your own clergy, Modis Tirsons. Reverend Tirsons was a cool minister. At least that's how I felt about him. He always started his sermons with a description of a Peanuts cartoon or a joke. Time magazine had an article describing the events at the 1980 Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that convened in Madrid. Quote, "The object of the long-scheduled conference was to review the members' compliance with the 1975 Helsinki Accords on Military Security, Economic Cooperation, and Human Rights. But throughout, it was clear that the Soviets had every intention of blocking any proceedings devoted to their own human rights record or their Afghanistan invasion. Adding to Moscow's discomfiture was a surge of human rights activism directly inspired by the Madrid conference. Some 8,000 scientists from 44 non-communist countries broke relations with Soviet scientific organizations to protest the persecution of Soviet colleagues. In 7 Soviet cities, 139 Jewish dissidents began a 3-day hunger strike, while 100 others crowded into Moscow's Supreme Soviet building, demanding to emigrate to Israel. Exiles from the USSR converged upon Madrid to hold press conferences detailing repression at home. Outside the Palace of Congresses, Modis Tirsons, a 39-year-old Latvian-born Lutheran minister from Philadelphia, punctured a vein in his arm and dripped blood on a Soviet flag in a protest against Moscow's dominance of the Baltic states. When Reverend Tirsons punctured a vein, end quote. When Reverend Tirsons punctured a vein and let his blood drip onto the Soviet flag in Madrid, it wasn't just a symbolic act. It was a visceral, physical reminder that our fight had cost us so much already. Blood had been spilled. It was a call that echoed through the airwaves and in print, daring the world to look away. Looking back at those powerful demonstrations, acts of courage and defiance against a seemingly immovable regime, whether through hunger strikes, symbolic protests, or the bloodshed on a Soviet flag, we made sure the world couldn't ignore us. And it worked. Latvia, along with Estonia and Lithuania, regained their independence. But the work didn't end there, and it still doesn't end. The lessons of those years are ones that we carry with us now. Freedom, human rights, and justice are never guaranteed. They must be fought for again and again, generation after generation. Today, as I see others taking up this mantle, fighting for human rights, for truth, and for a world where every voice is heard, I'm reminded that good trouble is as necessary as ever. We may not always face the same enemies, but the struggle for dignity, justice, and freedom is timeless. I see new generations taking up this mantle because the children of my generation still identify as Baltic Americans, continuing to participate in the culture environment that our parents and grandparents cultivated. I feel a deep connection, the blood, sweat, and tears of my grandparents, my parents, and now us. We are still fighting. Grandmother Iren's fear that our voices, language, and culture could be lost has not come true because we refuse to let it.
And now our last presentation, our last eyewitness today is Uwe Hagens, whose story is perhaps the most dramatic that you will hear. As Mr. Chakars read to you, she was born in Toronto, and she did many, many things, and she'll tell you about those herself. But she did, since she lived in Latvia from 1989 to 1994, she witnessed the country change from a Soviet-occupied totalitarian state to a fully independent democracy. Uwe?
Thank you, Paldies. The Latvian barricades of 1991. I like the way Martin put it. I was there. This happened. And as you've heard, I grew up in Toronto. I'm your accidental American, and I can vote. So in 1991, I was living in Riga. I was an English teacher and a translator. I was only 25 years old, which is when they say the brain actually matures in the human being. I was just curious to see the country that my grandparents had fled in World War II because those Russians had invaded. I went to Latvia for 3 months, ended up staying 5.5 years with my backpack. So in the winter of 91, the Soviet-occupied Baltic states had become so volatile and so dangerous. The Soviets faced mounting pressure to end the occupation. Oh, but instead they rolled in those tanks. They didn't actually leave, they just brought in more of them. And they attacked the radio and television centers in Vilnius, Lithuania. If you remember that, they killed 13 people there, people who were sitting around singing and dancing. And we in Latvia, we were watching and we were saying, holy P-dogs. We were expecting the same. So people barricaded the streets in Vetsriga and Old Town to protect the government and media buildings with anything they could find. Okay, concrete blocks and agricultural equipment, but people started dragging out old pieces of their cars, old mattresses. Think about that. They're going to hold off the Soviets with old mattresses. What does that tell you about what's going on? This was very grassroots and people were scared. So I wanted to help. My 25-year-old self did what all 25-year-olds do. They do what their friends do. So I signed up as a first aid volunteer because I was such an expert at first aid. And my friends and I went down to the Dome Cathedral, and they gave us a plan was to carry the injured, in case they got shot like in Lithuania, or, we all held our breaths because you might have to carry corpses. We were given first aid kits and Soviet-era gas masks. This is what every 25-year-old Canadian girl wants to carry around in her purse, right? We slept on the cold stone floor of the Dome Cathedral. These make lousy pillows. The first aid kits are slightly better for pillows, but we stayed overnight, not knowing what was going to happen. We had no idea. So on the evening of January 20th, I was working with Danish television because they sent some journalists over, and being one of the only native English speakers in the country, I was helping them out with the English language reporting. And I just finished my commentary with these lovely Danes, and I flicked off my mic, and then I heard gunshots. Whew. Then a bunch of journalists and filmmakers ran out of a nearby building, which, as some of you know, it's called Katyumaya, because it has some cats on the roof. These journalists and filmmakers, their names were Juris Podnieks, Gvido Zvaigsne, and Andris Slapinch. They came up to us and said, "Do you know where those shots came from?" And we said, "Yeah, over there by Baste Kalmpatkas." And we said, "Let's all go over there and see what's happening." So while we were gawking, they were filming, and it was really dark. And I heard more shots. The Soviet special forces were attacking the Interior Ministry right beside the park and the Rizina Hotel too. And then my friend, Juris Poškus, who I was with, he grabs him by the shoulder and he says, "Skrienam, let's run." I'm like, what? Oh, more shots. And then my other friend who I was with, Robert Skobzinch, he fell to his knees and he dived behind a tree. So I did what my friend did. I also dove behind a tree. Whew. I was happy about that tree because that tree had a bullet hole in it, and I did not have a bullet hole in me. But I was about 15 feet or so away from Andris Slapinch, who was shot. He was one of the filmmakers I ran into the park with, and his friend Guido Zweigsne also lay on the ground shot. What do you think these guys said? "Oh, get me a doctor?" One of them said, "Turpin filmet," like keep filming. What does that tell you about who these people are? They weren't afraid. They wanted to document this and carry on and fight, even though they were lying on the ground, dying. We were also in the line of fire, and we were scared. So we ran into an office building across the street, managed to find a phone, which back in the Soviet days wasn't easy. I managed to call the Canadian Embassy in Moscow to alert them, to alert the West, to tell them, to tell the West what was happening here right now. Yep, I remained in Riga. In August, the Soviet hardliners attempted a coup in Moscow to overthrow President Gorbachev. It failed. And then on August 21st, Latvia declared independence from the Soviet Union. Canada, my birth country, was the first G7 nation to establish an embassy in Latvia after the collapse. Oh, and they hired me to run it, and I loved every minute of it. I moved to Washington, D.C. in Latvia from 1994, but I will never, ever forget those really intense emotions from that time in my life and the history that I witnessed. For the first time in my life, I felt real fear, real shock, but I also felt real love and real pride for the people of Latvia who bravely stood up at the barricades for their right to finally be free. And now, because I too have a political science degree, I read the news a lot. I listen to news a lot, but I watch in horror when I see what's happening in Ukraine. Exactly what happened in World War II. The same invaders my grandparents fled. How could that be? How could that be? Are the Russians going to take over Ukraine and then Latvia? Are they going to take over my grandfather's building in Riga again? We just got it back in the 1990s. My twin brother oldest is living there, and they've got a little daycare called Zilet down there. Are they going to take it away again? What I witnessed in the 90s was the last gap of the Soviet Union. I'd like to end on a happy note, but what we see now is Putin trying to restore the Soviet Union by dominating its neighbors. Will Russia invade more democratic countries in Europe? It's easy to do because democracy is very vulnerable. So we need to cherish it. We need to protect it. Ukraine deserves independence and democracy, just like Latvia did. Europe deserves democracy, and the United States should stand by them. Long live a free and democratic Latvia, lai dzīvo brīva un demokrātiska Latvija. Paldies.
With this last eyewitness, we conclude this program of the Latvian Museum. The mission of the museum is to acquaint the world, both those of Latvian heritage and those who wish to know more about Latvia, about this beautiful, small, strategically located country in Northern Europe with its complex history and rich heritage and traditions. But we also realize that it's not enough just to have a museum located in one place, being in Rockville. And it is there because the diplomatic center of Latvians was always in Washington, because the US never did recognize the incorporation of Latvia into the Soviet Union. And therefore, that museum was established in 1980 and has gone through various iterations. And now this iteration has modernized it and has made it more accessible, both in language and in the way it is presented. And I hope all of you have a chance to look at everything, because we will be sending this same museum set up to various centers, to various Latvian centers who will be asked to partner with American centers throughout the country. And hopefully the whole world will one day know, every single person on this planet will know about Latvia, where it is, how important it is, and how beautiful it is. And I also wish that Latvia lives as long as this universe exists. May God bless Latvia. Dios svētī Latviju.
Thank you to all of our panelists, Liels Paldies, and thank you to our Kokla players. Where are you? Paldies Katrinai and Kristianim. Thanks for the music. There you go. Thank you. And I want to give a huge special thanks to Petrus Dajevskis. Petrus, where are you? There you are. Do you want to come up? I'd like to invite you up too. Please come on up. Please come on up. We need to give you flowers, but I also want to invite you to tell everybody about this exhibit and where it's going next, and maybe the tour.
What an amazing presentation today. I thank you all, panelists. I heard you once before, and every time you do it, it's better. It's very, very profound. You can't build an exhibit without content. Then come the ideas, the vision, the graphics, and all the rest. And so I do want to mention a few people who are fundamental to the content of this exhibit you'll be viewing. First of all, a colleague and a very good friend, Janis Chakars Jr. in Sweden, was the one with whom I first spoke about the visioning of what this could be. And anyone who knows Janis, he is a visionary in the way he views history. So he inspired us to contact Andrejs Plakans, who's late Andrejs Plakans, whose books really is the foundation to the show. Without an academic foundation, you can't have a credible exhibit. And so Andrejs Plakans was so forthcoming. And my wife, Ann Clausen, who's out there, who was the script writer for this show, worked with Andrejs, and then Lilita Berks, who was the director of the museum. She passed a few years ago. The conversations and the debates, not debates, insights we had with him changed our entire understanding of how to tell the story. So, and I want to conclude also with the role of Are, which has really inspired us to do all this work, along with Renat. Wald Greenberg, who is the head of the cultural division at Are, has been so supportive. You know, all these things cost money, and we're not talking just $1,000 here or there. We're talking about under $100,000 to produce something like this in Rockville and here. It takes a lot of guts to push for the resources to make things happen. So a huge thank you to Valda, and of course, to Martin, who was behind it and gave us also the go-ahead to go ahead with all this traveling plans. We're here. So enjoy. As our next step, we're going to remove some of the chairs to the back, so there's a little more room for you to walk around. But the exhibit starts over there on the right. It's chronological, as you probably had detected. And And so browse. There is sound on all these videos. I will turn them up just a bit. There's voiceover, which gives you commentary. And Lila Robbins, a very renowned Latin American actress, did the voiceover for us as a gift to the project. Thank you very much. Paldies.
The museum could not, in its previous life, from 1980 to 2016, could not have existed without Peter Zdajewskis, Ann Clausen, and Lilith Becks, the three people, and many others, who were all instrumental and have volunteered. All of this is volunteer work that have put in hours and hours and all their knowledge of museums. They are, all three of them, anthropologists and archaeologists. So we have professionals who have built this museum. I came into this because of the untimely demise of Lilith the Becks, and there really was no one at that point who in Washington who sort of could take over. And they asked me if I could unlock the door to the museum. And I said, yeah, I think I was in real estate, so I think I know how to unlock a door. So that's how it all started almost 2 years ago next month. And by unlocking the door, I saw how much it meant to have people come through and finally understand that this, what we are offering them, is very, very important in this world, especially today with Ukraine, with the Ukrainian situation being what it is. And there have been people who did not know the difference between Baltics and Balkans when they walked in, but certainly knew about it when they walked out. In that respect, I formed a team of people who have lived through that period and who also help us. Rita Lima is one of those who gives the tours of the museum. Then the idea of the touring museum, that was Peter's. Peter and Anne just said, hey, we can't be so selfish and keep this just in Rockville. We've got to have the world look at it. It has been a long journey that started at the beginning of this year, but because of Peter's I can't tell you how much I admire him, because he has driven this from approximately February of this year. We are now at this stage. And all this has been made, and everything has been thought through from A to Z and from 1 to 100. Peter, thank you so very, very much. And where is Anne? Where is Anne?
Yes, he is.
This is the literary brains behind the whole thing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you both of you so much. Thank you.
I have to add one comment to what Renat said. When I first met Renat, she came in into the library of the Latvian Center in Washington after Lilith was gone, and she said, well, I'm here to help. I said, oh, that's great. She said, I'll wash floors. Well, she's really moved ahead a lot. Paldies.
And I'll add one thing too, mums ir vīns un pierāgi. So, eat up.